Okay, so we are starting it's technically unit 4, but we're going to have two parts of this unit. We're going to split up the presidency and Congress, or executive and legislative. And so we're going to do the presidency first. So jumping into the presidency, the first part of this has to do with elections. We've already talked about all of this before in the last unit when we talked about elections and parties. So just go back through this. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this today, but make sure that you go back through these first couple of slides and make sure you understand how the Electoral College works, the issues with it, like the growth of political parties, the election of 1800. Remember, this is what brought about the 12th Amendment. So things like that with the Electoral College. And then, of course, the when and where they cast their votes. So going back to look at those dates, what to do if there's a tie. Remember, going into the House and the Senate for the Vice President. And remember, of course, the days and all of that. So we'll just kind of skip through this section because we've already talked about all of this. But like I said, go back over this and just make sure that you remember everything you need to know about the Electoral College and elections. Okay. All right. So let's see. Moving on here. Constitutional roles of the president. That's where we're going to start today. So these are roles, and you may see them sort of named differently other places, and that's okay. They still line up with what those roles are. The first one we're going to talk about is the chief of state. So this is the ceremonial head of the government. It's supposed to be the symbol of the people, the citizens of the country. So when people around the world think about the United States, they usually think about that person, our leader, even though, of course, we have the 3-branch system and they're supposed to all be equal. Of course, we know in reality that is not true, but we still have that head of state, so to speak, right? So that's the president. Chief executive, this is his role of executing laws or enforcing laws. So this is his major role according to the Constitution. It's his job to enforce laws that are passed by Congress and therefore carry out the public's will, right? So that's laws becoming policy. The chief executive is then to carry out that policy and make it into, the will of the people into policy, right? Okay. The next thing is chief administrator. Of course, in order to do his job as chief executive, he has the largest bureaucracy in the world. So all of those departments, all of those hundreds of agencies, thousands and thousands of people working as part of the bureaucracy in order to carry out or execute the laws. Okay, so that's chief administrator. Okay, the next one is chief diplomat. We say that the president is chief diplomat because he is responsible for carrying out our relationships with other governments, other countries. Of course, he does that through the State Department, and but we call him chief diplomat. Of course, underneath him would be the Secretary of State, and then, of course, all of the ambassadors working in that department for each country or in each country. Okay, commander-in-chief, that is his direction of the military. So we have civilian control of our military. Remember, the top two in our military are civilians, the president and secretary of defense. Then as chief legislator, this is helping to design, of course, public policy through shaping the agenda for Congress. He does that usually through the State of the Union address. That's where he lays out his agenda that he wants Congress to pick up and pass legislation to fulfill. All right. And then, of course, he in turn then is supposed to carry out that legislation. Okay. All right. Chief jurist. Sometimes you won't see this one in a lot of government books, But it is important because he does have a role in the judicial branch in that he can issue pardons and amnesty. And we'll talk about that specifically a little bit later. In fact, we'll talk about each of these as we go through the unit, but this is just laying out those roles initially, right? So he also appoints federal judges and Supreme Court justices. So that kind of goes back to the judicial branch and chief jurist. All right, chief of party, he is the leader of his party. Chief citizen, this is kind of goes back to that the being the leader of the country and representing all citizens. Of course, he's also supposed to be sort of the moral leader, and I put quotes around moral because obviously we know that that's not always been the case with many of our presidents, but that's sort of what that office is supposed to be. Okay. All right, so we'll go back through all of those roles as we go through this and get examples and specifics on those things. All right, formal qualifications, natural born citizen, 35 years of age, and have lived in the country for 14 consecutive years before running for the office of the presidency. We talked about a couple of qualifications that are not okay, sorry about that. So we have talked about a list of things that are not necessarily required as far as formal qualifications, but that most presidents need to have in order to win the office. We talked about some of these back when we talked about some of the congressional advantages and things like that of getting elected. So when we talk about the president, though, that person usually has to have had some sort of public service so that people can look at their record. That's usually a requirement. Of course, that has changed a little bit here recently. Donald Trump never held public office before the highest office. So, he didn't really have that record of public service. And when I say record of public service, I mean that we can look to see what policy issue or what policies that person has favored in the past, that kind of thing. So there's sort of that official record of the things that they've done in public service. All right. Usually they have to be in middle of the road as far as their ideology, usually very, very conservative and very, very liberal. People do not get elected because you have to get that middle ground vote, that independent vote. We've seen that change a little bit in modern history, especially with Obama and then now Trump. We have much more polarized leaders here lately. And we even see, and we talked about this a little bit before, of course, that their ideology during the primary season looks a lot different than it does during the general election time period, right? So when they're trying to win their base for the primary elections, they tend to go more at the polar ends, right? So if you are a Democrat, you tend to be much more liberal to get that voter base that tends to vote. The majority of the primary voters are that party base. And then, of course, on the other side, conservatives tend to be sort of super conservative when they're looking for that base during the primaries. And then both sides move back towards the middle come election time in order to get that independent vote. All right. But as the parties are becoming more polarized, that's changing just a little bit here recently. All right. Also, presidents tend to have been either governors or senators in the past, and we'll see a list of that in just a minute. They tend to be Protestant as far as their religious beliefs. Of course, we've had one Catholic, but all of them, at least officially or on paper, have been Christian, except for, or well, all of them been Protestant Christians, I should say, except for Kennedy, who was a Catholic, right? So Christian, Protestant tend to have an advantage. They tend to come from large pivotal states, of course, to get those that support from those large states, that tends to help. So if most of them have been from California, New York, Ohio, Virginia, Florida, Texas, those bigger states, okay? They tend to, on the surface, be healthy, or they need to be. Of course, we know that that's not always been the case as well. But on the surface, as far as what people tend to know, the general person, general population tends to know that they are healthy. They, on the surface, again, are happily married. Of course, we know that's not always the case either. They need to have a very good speaking ability and, that stage presence. They're always, basically in a performance during the time that they are running for president and while they are president, constantly giving speeches, being on stage, that kind of thing. Some are much better than others. Like Ronald Reagan was known as a great communicator. Obama was known for having very good speaking skills. George W. Bush, not so much. Remember, he was known as that, just horrible at speech or giving speeches, but really good at one-on-one. So, but most of them do have that speaking ability or stage presence. All right, so this is just a list of presidents that were governors. You can see these are large pivotal states as far as electoral votes, but a lot of them you can see have been governors. Here are two slides of senators, right? So a long list of former senators, the last one being Obama. And of course, we've already talked about the fact that Trump has not held another office other than the presidency. Another thing that we tend to look for is military service. All right, so let me show you this graphic here. This shows all of the presidents that served active duty during the wartime. And then down at the bottom here, these were all active duty, but was not in an active theater of war, right? So no major war was going on while these guys were in service. So lots of them, had that record of military service. Okay. All right. So let's see. I can get this to go back. Oops. Try that again. Okay. So term of office, we've already discussed this as well. 4-year terms. No third term tradition in the beginning. Remember, Washington served 2 terms, so everyone after that took precedent, or he set the precedence for 2 terms up until, of course, FDR. And after his 4 terms, the 22nd Amendment was passed. Remember, 22nd, 2 terms, max of 10 years. Okay. Remember, we talked about why it's 10 and not 8 with the, if they have been vice president and then took over for their president's term, they could still serve 2 full terms. Okay. Salary and compensation, spending accounts. The president makes $400,000 a year. These are his travel expenses and entertainment and so forth. Of course, when we look at the travel allowance, that is personal money for him to spend. That is not including any of the taxpayer dollars spent for travel. And we'll talk about that as well. But so here we go, benefits. Of course, he gets to live in the White House, ride on Air Force One and other planes. And when we talk about the cost of presidential travel, just kind of think about this. For Air Force One, it takes over $200,000 per hour that it's in operation for it to run, right? It's maintenance and all of those things. So that's very expensive, of course. Anytime the president, though, leaves the White House, the safety of the White House, it's upwards of $1 million, right? Even if he's just going down the road, just think about all of the things that have to take place for the president to leave the White House. And it's kind of hard to fathom how much, goes into it. And that's why I'm going to show you guys the Secret Service video that I talked about. I think I mentioned it before. You will really get to see what goes into protecting the president, but also in, coordinating his travel and keeping him safe when he leaves the White House. So it's very interesting, but you'll get to see why it's so expensive. Okay. Also, the fleet of cars and SUVs that accompany the president. Of course, then there's what they call the Beast, which is the presidential limousine, and you'll see that in the video as well. It talks about how all that's equipped and so forth. So, various helicopters, of course. When he leaves the White House, he gets on Marine One, and Marine One is the helicopter that takes him to Joint Base Andrews or Andrews Air Force Base, and he gets on Air Force One from there to travel. Also, Camp David, that's the presidential retreat outside of Washington that lots of presidents use, some more than others. Of course, we've had some presidents that have their own sort of camp wherever their home is that they spend um, working hours, like meeting with world leaders, that kind of thing. So it's not that they're necessarily leaving the White House to go on vacation. Like Trump goes to Mar-a-Lago, George W. Bush went to his ranch in Crawford, Texas. A lot of presidents use Camp David for those events, like meeting with world leaders and things like that. Of course, they have a medical team. There's a team of doctors that go with the president everywhere he goes. He has full medical, of course, coverage. He has a pension. Right now, it's at 210.7. That's what it is after he leaves per year. Of course, he gets paid while in office 400,000. Lots of presidents will donate that. Like Trump has been donating his salary every quarter to different like one quarter he did it to help hurricane victims after this past hurricane, things like that. So charities, many of them will do that. Okay, so the vice president, we're just going to quickly talk about him real quick right here. Two formal duties: to preside over the Senate and to help decide presidential disability. We talked about that a little bit in the last unit, or the first unit, when we talked about the 25th Amendment. But these are the only two formal duties of the vice president. Okay, remember we talked about as well that he is not at the Senate on a day-to-day basis. He, of course, can break a tie. There is a tie in the Senate. He gets to vote. But usually the vice president is not in the Senate on a day-to-day basis. Okay. He is, though, of course, important because he is second in line to the presidency. And 9 of them have become president through assassination, death, or resignation. The problem is with that sometimes they are not chosen for necessarily their qualifications to be president. They are chosen for their personality or because of where they're from, right? And their popularity in that region of the country. So if you have a president from the East Coast, they may pick someone from the West Coast to become their vice president in order to bring in support from the other side of the country. Also, they may choose a person to sort of balance out their personality, which is much like what Donald Trump and Mike Pence are. So Donald Trump is that boisterous, kind of in your face personality, and then Mike Pence kind of balances that out because he's very meek and mild mannered and very, soft spoken, that kind of thing. So they kind of balance each other out. So sometimes they're chosen for that reason. I mean, and not to say that they're not necessarily qualified, but sometimes they're not, right? The vice presidency has been vacant 18 times. The 25th Amendment sort of fixed that problem as well, because originally in the Constitution, it didn't say what to do if a vice president resigned or was killed or died in office. The 25th Amendment fixed that and said that the president can appoint their own vice president until the next election. The 25th Amendment, remember, we already talked about, also provided the line of succession as far as, who would take control after the vice president. And then, of course, along with that sort of reinforced that was the Presidential Succession Act of 1947. Okay, so that laid out specifically the line of succession. Okay. We also talked about, well, here's the line of succession, right? So vice president, speaker, and president pro tem. And then, of course, it goes through the cabinet secretaries in the order that the cabinet office was created. So the last one would be Homeland Security. And then, of course, it would go through the ranking members of Congress all the way through. So that's 535 more people they have, right, in that line. Okay, so also though, the 25th Amendment decided presidential disability and what happens. So if the 25th Amendment can be invoked if the president decides, okay, I can't do my office right now, I can't perform my office, he would inform Congress in writing that he can't perform his duties. And Congress would take the powers of the presidency and transfer them to the vice president. The vice president and the majority of the cabinet can also do it without the president's say so, or even against the president's wishes. The vice president and the majority of the cabinet can inform Congress that the president's unable, and then Congress would then take those powers and transfer them. The president can regain his office, though, when he informs Congress that no inability exists. Congress has 21 days to decide, and after that, the 21st day, they will either return powers or decide that he is not fit. Okay, and that process kind of starts over from there. Okay. All right. We talked about this, I think, before too, after what happened with Reagan being shot, but not, of course, being killed, and the fact that the 25th Amendment had not been invoked, and it should have. Remember, after that, they sort of went almost overboard with it. And so every time the president would have some sort of, anesthesia or anything like that, they would invoke the 25th. And here are a few times that it has been done with Reagan and then with George W. Bush. And I want to say that Obama may have done it as well. I haven't looked that up yet, but I believe that he did that maybe for a short time for a procedure. So, that's sort of commonplace now for the 25th Amendment to be invoked. Okay, so we will pick up here next time and talk about all of those roles of the presidency.